Michael Jackson did not wear costumes. That distinction matters more than it might initially seem. Costumes are things performers put on to signal a character or a role. What Michael Jackson wore was something more deliberate and more permanent than that. It was a visual language he constructed over the course of 5 decades, a language with its own grammar and its own logic and its own rules that he enforced with the same precision he brought to every other dimension of his work. Understanding that language requires starting where the language started, not with the famous red jacket or the military regalia of the history era, with a single glove on the right hand of a 24-year-old man standing under the lights of a television studio in May 1983. The Motown 25 performance of Billie Jean is the moment that separated Michael Jackson from every entertainer who had come before him, and most who have come since. Everything that happened in that performance was deliberate. The choreography, the sudden stillness, the slide that the world would immediately name the moonwalk, and the glove. A single right-hand piece covered in hand-sewn rhinestones. Not 2 gloves, 1. The asymmetry was not an oversight. It was the entire point. Michael understood something about the human eye that most performers never consciously articulate. The eye is drawn to disruption, to things that do not follow the pattern the brain has been taught to expect. 2 gloves would have been decoration. 1 glove was a visual problem that the eye had to solve by focusing on it. And in solving that problem, the eye was locked onto his hand. Every flick, every point, every spin, every detail of choreography that his fingers executed in that performance was framed by the thing the eye could not stop looking at. The glove was a spotlight he wore on his body. Over the years, Michael Bush and Dennis Tompkins produced multiple versions of that glove, some heavier with crystal density for filming, where the camera would capture detail that a live audience could not see, some lighter for performances, where movement required minimizing additional weight. The configuration changed, the concept never did. After his death, one of those gloves sold at auction for hundreds of thousands of dollars, a piece of fabric with some rhinestones attached. The figure tells you something specific about how completely the object had burned itself into the collective imagination of the people who watched him work. The black sequin jacket that Michael wore for that same Motown 25 performance was made by his mother. That sentence requires pausing on because the visual that launched a global phenomenon was not produced by a famous fashion house. It was not the result of a commission placed with an established designer. Katherine Jackson sat down with sequins and thread and a sewing machine and made the jacket her son wore on the night that changed popular music. The silhouette was deliberately simple, cropped short, nothing bulky or restrictive in the shoulders or arms. Everything about the construction prioritized freedom of movement. When the sequins caught the television studio lights, they shimmered with every pivot and glide, and the look that would define his solo career assembled itself on screen. The glove, the jacket, the fedora, the loafers, all of it present simultaneously for the first time. One of the most copied stage costumes of the 20th century began at home. The red leather jacket that defined the Thriller short film came from a different source and served a different purpose. Deborah Nadelman Landis designed it by pulling from 2 directions that should not have been able to occupy the same garment. 1950s collegiate style, modern punk. The color was a deliberate choice, not simply red, crimson, almost aggressive in its intensity. The shoulders winged out to broaden Michael's frame visually. The front featured a sharp black V-shaped trim that directed the eye downward. The jacket made him look physically larger and more imposing during the film's dance sequences. It gave him a commanding presence that his slender build would not otherwise have projected. Only 2 jackets were made for the entire production. One sold at auction in 2011 for $1.8 million. A figure that would have seemed implausible for a costume from a music video if the music video in question had been any other music video. But Thriller was not simply a music video. It was a 14-minute short film that redefined the relationship between music and visual storytelling and became the most analyzed piece of visual media in the history of popular music. The jacket that commanded the screen during its dance sequences absorbed all of that cultural weight. It became a Halloween staple, a fashion reference point, a museum piece, a Halloween costume reproduced by tens of millions of people across 40 years. Few garments ever worn by any performer in any era have achieved that level of cultural saturation across that many generations. The white suit and white fedora from the smooth criminal sequence in the 1988 Moonwalker film worked through a completely different visual logic. The inspiration was classic Hollywood. The gangster films of the 1940s. Actors moving through smoke-filled rooms with a particular kind of lethal grace that came from the precision of their clothing. The suit was clean, the lines were sharp. The fedora sat low over Michael's eyes. But the suit was also a piece of engineering. The famous anti-gravity lean that the smooth criminal performance contained required shoes that locked mechanically into the stage floor through a patented system that Michael himself worked with engineers to develop. The suit had to accommodate the mechanics of that system without bunching or tearing or changing shape at the critical moment. The internal reinforcement required to achieve this was invisible from the front of the house. The audience saw a man tilting forward at an angle that seemed to violate physics. What made that possible was a collaboration between choreography and engineering that had required months of testing in a secured workshop, where Michael worked with the engineers directly, talking to them about the pressure on his ankles and calves as he tested the lean incrementally. The fedora was the element that completed the transformation. Michael used it with a specific ritualistic function. The moment it went on his head, the shift from man to performer was complete. The audience in the room knew it. The people watching on screen knew it. The hat announced that what was about to happen existed in a different register from ordinary reality. He used it technically throughout performances, to shade his eyes during slow, deliberate poses that built tension before a sudden release of movement, to punctuate sharp staccato gestures where the brim cut through the air with the precision of a blade, to maintain the clean visual line of his body during the lean itself. The hat was not a prop. It was a tool, and Michael understood the difference. The Bad Leather Ensemble from Martin Scorsese's 1987 short film represented the hardest pivot in his visual history. Everything he had worn before had pushed toward royalty, toward fantasy, toward something that existed in a register above ordinary reality. The bad costume went the opposite direction entirely. All black leather, multiple zippers, silver buckles, a plain white t-shirt underneath. The hardware was exaggerated. The shoulders were structured and confrontational. The entire assembly read as tough and street credible in a way that none of his previous work had attempted. The narrative of the film demanded it. Michael played a private school student returning to his rough neighborhood. The visual question the costume had to answer was whether this person still belonged to that world or had been changed beyond recognition by the privilege he had accessed. The leather answered it. He wore the jacket of someone who had not forgotten where he came from. The look was everywhere in the late 1980s, copied by fans and fashion brands simultaneously. He had shifted his entire visual language to match a new musical era, and the culture had moved with him. The gold bodysuit from the History campaign in 1995 was the most conceptually ambitious single costume he ever wore. The suit was sculpted to his body with such precision that he appeared to have been cast in metal, paired with circular mirrored sunglasses that removed his eyes from view entirely. He stood motionless in promotional imagery, radiating a cold, monumental power that felt simultaneously grandiose and deeply unsettling. The History campaign featured footage of an enormous statue of Michael being unveiled to a roaring crowd. The gold bodysuit dissolved the boundary between the man and the monument, between a living performer and a historical artifact. It was a costume about legacy, about choosing to be seen as history while still being present enough to perform. No other pop star at any point in the commercial history of popular music had attempted anything quite so conceptually ambitious with a single promotional image. The bodysuit was not built to move. It was built to stand forever. In photographs taken more than 30 years ago, it still does. The Remember the Time. Egyptian robes from the 1992 short film directed by John Singleton approached the question of visual language from an entirely different angle. The film placed Michael in an ancient Egyptian palace setting with a cast that included Eddie Murphy, Iman, and Magic Johnson. It was a deliberate gathering of black cultural excellence at the peak of the powers of each person involved. The robes were cut from fabric threaded with gold and layered to flow dramatically during the sand-spinning dance sequence, where Michael moved across the floor as though friction had been suspended specifically for him. The costume fused African royal aesthetics with his own futuristic sensibility. It presented him as a mystical entertainer arriving at a court of power and taking it over through performance alone. Where his military jackets projected authority through rigidity and precision ornament, these robes projected authority through movement and drape. They revealed a dimension of his physical intelligence that the structured jackets could not access, the quality of grace, of liquid movement that makes difficult things look effortless in ways that are more mysterious than precision because you cannot see the mechanics. The white button-down and black trousers from the Black or White video in 1991 represented the most politically precise wardrobe choice he ever made. The song argued for racial unity. The costume argued alongside it by removing every element that had ever separated Michael on stage from the people watching him. No sequins, no military braiding, no gold, no crystal. No element that communicated distance or elevation or the kind of visual royalty his other costumes deliberately constructed. The shirt hung loose, untucked. Anyone watching could have been wearing it. That accessibility was the entire point. The message of the song landed differently because the person delivering it had dressed himself to stand at the same level as the audience, rather than above it. It remains his most effective use of clothing as a political statement. Proof that the most powerful thing a wardrobe can do is sometimes to disappear. The They Don't Care About Us prison uniform from Spike Lee's 1996 video was his most confrontational use of wardrobe in his entire career. The song addressed systemic violence and injustice. The prison uniform aligned his body with the incarcerated and the oppressed. No crystals, no gold, no military braiding, no fedora. The institutional fabric was the starkest possible contrast to everything else in his wardrobe from the same period. The gold-plated shin guards and pearl jackets of the History Tour existed simultaneously with this uniform, and the contrast between them was not accidental. It was the point. He removed the icon. He left the man, and the anger and the protest exposed. Spike Lee's documentary-style direction amplified the rawness. For a performer who had built his entire visual identity around spectacle and fantasy, the prison uniform was a gut punch. A reminder that the most powerful costume is sometimes the one that refuses to perform as a costume at all. The Earth Song distressed shirt from the 1996 World Music Awards performance worked through related logic from a different emotional angle. The fabric was deliberately destroyed. It hung in shreds. As the performance built to its emotional climax, the shirt's fragility mirrored the song's subject directly. Michael's movements grew more desperate and physically exposed. Sweat and exhaustion became visible parts of the performance. The deliberate deterioration of the garment told the story alongside the music in a way that a polished costume could not have achieved. It was costume as confession. Every layer of artifice removed until only the message remained. Michael Bush used a phrase to describe the underlying philosophy that had guided his 25-year collaboration with Michael and Dennis Tompkins. Liberace goes to war. The phrase captured something essential. Liberace's flamboyant, crystal-covered opulence on one side, the rigid, commanding authority of military uniforms on the other. Michael wanted both simultaneously. He was drawn to the image of a knight in shining armor wearing a form-fitting uniform. He told Bush directly that a uniform commands attention. Bush and Tompkins took that instinct and built a visual language from it. The collaboration between those three men produced some of the most recognizable stage costumes ever made. But the collaboration required skills that had to be invented because they did not previously exist in any design program or fashion atelier. Tompkins taught himself to work with metal. He spent weeks learning to solder and sandblast so he could create a sterling silver crown from scratch. He built the capacity to replicate the craftsmanship of historical armor and crowns, because Michael wanted not copies of those objects, but the real energy of those garments translated into something he could dance in. Tompkins studied European royal regalia in museums and paid particular attention to King Henry VIII, whose imposing silhouettes and broad ornamented shoulders directly informed the stage jackets they created for Michael. Bush spent late nights and early mornings repairing zippers that had been destroyed during performances. The Beat It jackets were intentionally destroyed every night. Michael tore them off during the choreographed finale and hurled them to the stage floor and stomped on them. The violence was not theatrical mimicry. It was real. The zippers took the worst of the impact. After each show, Michael would tell Bush that the zippers needed to be fixed. Bush would return to his workroom and spend the hours between that night's performance and the following day's sound check painstakingly repairing mangled hardware so the jacket would be stage ready again. This cycle of destruction and restoration happened at every stop of every tour. The repair work was invisible to every audience in every city. The consistency of the spectacle those audiences received depended entirely on work they never knew had happened. The light-up version of the Thriller jacket required 3 engineers to wire 11,000 individual bulbs and a dedicated computer technician operating a remote control system during the actual performance. This was not a standard theatrical challenge. It was an engineering problem that had no existing solution. Bush and Tompkins solved it because Michael's vision required them to, and because saying no to an idea simply because it seemed impossible was not an option they recognized as legitimate. Bush developed 4 principles that governed every garment commissioned for Michael. He called them the 4 Fs. Fit, function, fun, first. Fit meant the costume had to move like a second skin, not clothing worn over a body, but clothing that functioned as an extension of it. Nothing could bunch or pull or restrict the movement vocabulary that Michael required. Function was the most demanding rule in practical terms. Nothing could cause a slip or a fall or any disruption to the performance under any circumstances. The stage was a physical environment with specific hazards, and every garment had to be designed with those hazards accounted for. Fun permitted whimsy. The childlike wonder that ran through Michael's aesthetic sensibility and that drew constantly on Disney imagery and fairy tale logic. First was perhaps the most demanding rule because it operated without compromise. Every design had to be genuinely new, not an evolution of a previous success, not a refinement of something audiences had already responded to, something that had not existed before. Bush and Tompkins were explicitly forbidden from replicating a successful look, regardless of how much an audience had loved it. This is why Michael's wardrobe stayed genuinely unpredictable across 30 years of performing. The 4 Fs made repetition impossible. Michael's shoe philosophy was equally specific and equally practical. He refused to let anyone polish his stage loafers, and the reason had nothing to do with superstition or personal eccentricity. Worn leather provided grip, a layer of polish, introduced a slip risk on a stage floor that could end a performance and injure him. A twisted ankle would put the entire touring company out of work. He said this to Bush directly and without any ambiguity about how seriously he meant it. When the Captain EO science fiction boots required for filming prevented him from executing his choreography properly, he did not adapt his performance to accommodate the footwear. The soles were cut from the provided boots, so his trusted loafers could be hidden inside the futuristic outer shell. The aesthetic requirements of the film were real. They were simply not allowed to override the functional requirements of performance. His feet were the foundation of everything his body could do on a stage. Footwear was equipment. It was treated with the seriousness that an athlete brings to gear before a championship competition. The research that informed the military costumes was not casual. Michael and his designers made trips to museums specifically to study the construction and proportion and visual language of historical royal regalia. He would walk through European museums and see antique royal costumes behind glass and want to understand how they communicated what they communicated. Not to reproduce them directly, but to extract the principles behind them. The principle of shoulder width that communicated authority, the principle of ornament that communicated wealth at a distance, the principle of rigidity that communicated immovability and power. These principles were then translated into garments that could survive the choreography of a performer who was simultaneously executing the most physically demanding work in pop music. The result was stage wear that read from the farthest seats in a stadium as genuinely monarchical, while functioning at close range as precisely engineered dance costumes. The werewolf transformation that opens the thriller short film represented a different kind of creative risk. Rick Baker created the full-body costume, including extensive facial prosthetics that reshaped Michael's entire face. Yellow contact lenses, fur, clawed hands. Michael willingly buried the most famous face in the world under layers of movie monster makeup for the opening minutes of what would become the most celebrated music video ever made. He trusted the character and the narrative completely over his pop star image. Few artists at the commercial peak he occupied in 1983 would have taken that risk. The werewolf sequence worked because Michael committed to it without reservation. He was not playing a monster as a gag or as a knowing wink at the audience. He was a monster. The commitment was total. This was consistent with a principle that ran through every aspect of his approach to visual presentation. The costume was never decoration. It was always in service of something, a narrative, a statement, a physical requirement, a conceptual argument about who he was or what the music was saying. When it served none of those purposes, he removed it. The simplicity of the black or white wardrobe existed because simplicity was what the message required. The complexity of the dangerous tour military jackets existed because complexity was what that era of his work was communicating. The principle Michael articulated most directly was about the relationship between his clothing and the people watching him. He told Bush that if a man in the front row could afford to buy and wear the same thing he was wearing, then Michael would stop being the entertainer. The clothes had to be visibly and undeniably out of reach. This was not vanity, it was theater. The relationship between a performer and an audience depends on the performer existing in a register that is distinct from the audience's ordinary reality. If the visual language of the performer is indistinguishable from what the audience could access, the performer stops being a destination. The audience stops being transported. The 18-karat gold plating on the shin guards, the custom-molded metal armor, the bullion embroidery that required hundreds of hours of handwork. These were not expressions of excess. They were tools for maintaining the specific distance that performance requires between the person on stage and the people watching. Every piece was made exactly to his body, cut and reinforced for the movements he specifically executed. Useless to anyone else because nobody else was executing those movements in that body. The costumes were architecture for the show, purpose-built for a single performer, and for 25 years, the people who built them worked without saying no to an idea simply because it had never been done. Michael told Bush once to dust him. He was asking for magic. Not the surface appearance of magic, but the real thing. The collaboration that Bush and Tompkins maintained with him for a quarter century was built on the understanding that magic was always the goal, and that achieving it required inventing the skills necessary to produce it, because those skills did not always previously exist. The clothes outlived him. They are scattered across museums and private collections and auction houses and the display cases of fans who have spent decades acquiring pieces of what he built. The individual gloves, the jackets, the fedoras, the gold bodysuit, the distressed shirt, the prison uniform, each one carrying the specific weight of what it was used to communicate during the performance that gave it its meaning. And inside the jacket in which he was buried, Tinkerbell was sewn into the lining. Bush placed her there, a final detail from the hands that had spent 25 years turning Michael Jackson's vision of himself into fabric and crystal and metal and leather that the world could see. The public never knew that detail. It was not meant for the public. It was the last private gesture between a designer and the man he had dressed for a quarter century. The last acknowledgement that underneath all of the rhinestones and gold and military braiding and engineered leather, there had always been something that existed prior to the spectacle. A person who believed in magic, who had asked for it consistently across every performance of his career, and who had found in the people around him collaborators willing to spend decades inventing whatever skills were necessary to provide it. The Tinkerbell was for him, everything else was for the world.